And that song, of course, is Revival by Jeff Bullock, who has very kindly given me permission to use his music and has always been a super great support. I do apologise that we didn't have a better recording of that. I kind of get a little bit technically behind in things. Thank you so much to Jeff for that song and for so much more. Welcome everyone to Leaving Hillsong. If you're a leaver, if you're a believer, if you're both, if you're any kind of person who's interested in this trial of the evangelical century. My name is Tanya, and I'm super excited to announce that Nathan Zamprogno will join me today in sifting through this stuff. You will remember Nathan from season 1, episode A Bald-Faced Lie. Court dates were recently set for the trial of Brian Houston, the former global senior pastor of Hillsong, for the 2nd of December, in the end of this week. He's being tried on one count of concealing child abuse. And while we have very stringent laws, which we'll outline in Australia, I thought it would be quite useful for everybody to kind of understand, or anybody, the process and how we got to here and what people can expect to happen, because I think there's a lot more attention on this trial than just the people who might know the individual concerned. There's been all kinds of changes to legislation and a lot of things have transpired over the years. This is merely just going to be a factual discussion of court process in Australia and how we got here and what kind of pressures are on our political systems and, what's going on right now. We don't have the freedom to speculate or to guess or to gamble or predict or any of those kinds of things here because our laws do not allow for that, and we will explain that. So the point of today's podcast is, not to lay any bets. It's just to try and simplify things, especially for people who aren't up to date with all of the changes in Australian news. Neither Nathan or I are lawyers, obviously. This is not we're not prescribing or proscribing or anything like that. We are just collating a bunch of information, and I hope that it's helpful for you in making sense out of this case. Not saying we got it 100% either, but it should help a little bit. So please welcome Nathan Zamprogno again for an episode called Trials and Tribulations. So Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today to try and sift through some of this information. You've had a bit of a background. I mean, you're a councillor on a local council in Sydney's West. You've been voted in there and serving for quite some years now. What other kinds of reasons do you have an interest in this case?
Look, I kind of come at this from multiple angles. One is because I'm a civically engaged person, and I think that these issues are of sufficient importance. People should be better informed about them, especially when churches and other religious organisations enjoy tax-exempt status, which is a kind of tacit endorsement of what they do at the cost of the public purse. I'm also a school teacher, and I teach critical thinking and ethics to young people. And one of the things that I try and teach young people is to be, A, engaged in their communities, and B, to be sceptical about truth claims that are presented to them, regardless of whether they're in business or whether they're political, or indeed if they're religious as well. And not to push any particular barrow, but to equip young people with a critical thinking toolkit so that they have the ability to weigh these claims and work out what's worth following and what's not.
And I mean, you've got a much better understanding of the way our governments operate as well on a federal and a local and a state level than I can hope to. I mean, you're a member of our democracy yourself, so...
Yeah, I'm in local government and I've worked for state and federal parliamentarians, which I suppose gives me a layman's understanding of these things, including and importantly in this case, an understanding of what sub judice means and what's appropriate for us to say and not say in a setting like this.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, because our system, I think, from an outsider's point of view, only 27 or something % of people listening to this podcast are Australian, and our system might look quite foreign to people outside of that. So, wonderful. Before we start anything, Leah, let's go over this sub judice idea, because the Americans have got court TV. We all watched OJ down the freeway. We watched that whole trial take place. There'll be none of that going on in Australia. And in fact, there's not even that much in the media at the moment. So can you explain to the people why we're not allowed to discuss the case of R.V. Brian Charles Houston?
All right then. Okay, so the first caveat is I am not a lawyer.
No.
I'm simply an engaged citizen that's trying to pick my way carefully through this. Sub judice is an important legal principle that says that a person who is about to come to court on a criminal charge has a right to a fair hearing, and that it would be inappropriate for people to be improperly influenced by, commentary in the public space that could improperly influence a jury or a witness. And sub judice involves publishing any material which could have, and I'll read from a definition, a real and definite tendency to prejudice the legal proceedings. So it's perfectly appropriate for us to talk about what's gone before, what's manifestly in the public domain, and to talk about process, and to perhaps help some of our overseas listeners to understand some of the interesting and different points of the way that the Australian law system works, because it is very different in some respects to the American system.
Well, it's been such a convoluted process to arrive in court for this criminal trial anyway, so I think it'll be useful for all of us, me included, to kind of go through what happened. Just to be really clear from the outset, there'll be no opinions being given, there'll be no kind of suggestions or speculations or thoughts or personal bias going on here at all. It's not fair, it's not right, it's not legal, it's not happening, but there is still a whole lot of information that makes it a lot clearer to understand what this case is about, and I think that's really important, yeah?
No, absolutely. So let's start with the prehistory of this.
I mean, if we're going to take it from the very start, the Americans have, the people versus Larry Flint. Why have we got R versus somebody?
Then. So in Australia, we have a Westminster system of government, and the Crown, the sovereign, currently King Charles, is the head of state. And in the Australian legal system, justice comes from the Crown, not from another organ of government. And that's why when you walk into an Australian courtroom, the coat of arms above the judge's desk is often the royal coat of arms, as a symbol that justice flows from the Crown and justice is protected and flows from the Crown. So the term R versus, R stands for, in this case, Rex.
Okay.
Now Queen Elizabeth recently passed. Prior to her passing, it was Regina.
That's right.
Regina versus the defendant, or Rex versus the defendant.
Who's Rex?
Rex is the sovereign, because justice flows from the Crown, and it is the Crown that brings any criminal prosecution rather than, an arm of the legislature or something like that. And this is a criminal trial.
Just for those of us who were brought up on LA law and Hill Street Blues, and me showing my age again, but, objection, Your Honour, and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't work that way here. Can you run us through quickly why there are some people running around with wigs on in this courtroom and some regular lawyers? How does that go?
All right then. So, again, because we've cleaved more closely to the Westminster tradition, the tradition of having, wigs and robes and jackets and what's called a jabot, which is a piece of cloth that hangs down the front, dates from the 1600s. And in our common law tradition, courts have a certain authority. They have a gravitas. It denotes the fact that they mean business, and that you're not in an ordinary business or social setting. And when you're being asked a question by somebody with that garb, you have a very, very specific obligation to tell the truth.
Okay, but I mean, what's the difference between one of the wig wearers and the regular?
It depends on which court you're in. In traditional criminal courts, the wearing of wigs and robes still prevails. If you're in the family law system and something that's being prosecuted is a divorce or a custody hearing, they've restructured those courts since about 1988, and the wearing of wigs and robes is reduced to make the setting more friendly.
Right.
I think that in a criminal court, people still prefer to see the trappings of authority as a reminder that this is a very serious business.
Well, I mean, the barrister is instructed by the solicitors who are more junior to them then, aren't they?
Well, I mean, solicitors or paralegals assist the court in their function, but
Right.
the barrister and the judge, who are the real heavy hitters,
Okay.
they are often the ones that wear the wigs and the robes.
Okay, terrific. I mean, it just can look all so strange. Now, just going back a bit, we saw the Assemblies of God, or the ACC as they were at the time. We saw these guys in court years ago, didn't we? What was all that about with Hillsong in
That's
court?
right. All right then. So in 2012, the federal government instituted what's called a Royal Commission. Now, a Royal Commission is the highest form of public inquiry in Australia.
Okay.
There is no higher. To liken it to our overseas audience, it would be like a congressional inquiry or a Senate inquiry.
Okay.
And it has very broad powers. The power is conferred by what are called letters patent that are issued by the Governor-General, because again, this is a process that's driven by the Crown.
Okay.
It's initiated by the government of the day, but it carries the authority of the Crown. They have extremely broad powers to summon witnesses, to require the production of documents. They can make findings of fact, but they don't prosecute anybody. So for our listeners who have maybe seen YouTube clips of other church officials giving testimony between 2012 and 2014, that was a Royal Commission. But it wasn't a prosecution, but significantly, if there are adverse findings from a Royal Commission, they can be referred to a Department of Public Prosecutions, and then the police can take up whether a prosecution should be brought for a criminal breach. And in this case, that appears to be what's happened.
So the Royal Commission that we're talking about was into, and it was such a long term at the time, but it makes so much more sense now. This was an inquiry into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and that covered a range of institutions, sporting clubs, schools, detention centres, and churches as well. And I can't remember how many different institutions came before the commission.
Scores and scores. There were over 8,000 witnesses that provided testimony. There were 6 full-time commissioners that presided over this. It ran for more than 2 years, and the documents that were produced then came out over the subsequent years. There were, over 42,000 calls, 25,000 letters and emails received, and significantly there were over 2,500 referrals to the authorities, including to police, in the aftermath of this for potential criminal prosecutions for lapses in the institutional responses to some pretty horrific sexual abuse that occurred in a variety of religious organisations in Australia, and one that came very particularly into the focus, that was the subject of an entire tranche of those hearings, were the Australian Christian churches and their then largest member, Hillsong.
Yeah, and there were other cases as well in the Australian Christian churches, and there was a private Christian school that was examined closely as well. But obviously, for purposes of the title of this podcast and how we've kind of ended up with the Houstons back in the headlines, where we'll take a close look at this one. I want to just give one moment's recognition to our former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, for pushing this Royal Commission happening through right before she left office, because it has really changed the course of public discourse, I think, and how we as a nation had to look at a lot of these issues, whether people wanted to or not anymore. They became the subject of the nightly news, and it was a really, really wonderful thing for a number of reasons. Really tough going, but just so crucial to our culture and unpacking this stuff. All right, so at the end of a Royal Commission, once they've completed all their inquiries and investigations and called all the witnesses, that they make? I mean, there's a series of recommendations comes out, and then what? I mean, what's the point of this whole thing?
There was a report into the whole commission, but there were individual chapters devoted to the cases that came before the commission about the Australian Christian churches, their entities, schools and churches, and Hillsong particularly. And to be even more specific, about the actions of Frank Houston, who was Brian Houston's father, and who was a pioneer and founder of the denomination in Australia, and founded the church that was the progenitor of Hillsong. And in 1999, it became known that Frank Houston had committed some heinous acts of child sexual assault against a number of victims in the 1970s. In 2012, these issues were examined by the Royal Commission.
I thought it started in 2014.
Well, the Royal Commission began in 2012.
Okay, sorry.
So I'll start that sentence again.
Sorry, go. I knew you wouldn't have it wrong, but sorry.
So the Royal Commission, which began in 2012, took several years to kind of wend its way through all of the various organisations, and when Hillsong and the Australian Christian churches had their turn, Brian was examined about who knew what and when.
And so were several other members. I mean, General Manager George Agajanian went before them. The various members of...
Keith Ainge, John McMartin, and a variety of other people. And the good news is that all of that testimony is now available on YouTube. The transcripts are publicly available documents, and the findings of the Royal Commission were also made public. And what's of relevance to the current proceedings was that adverse findings were made about significant lapses in the policies and the way in which those policies were enforced about the reporting of sexual assault, particularly against minors, in the church organisation. And as a result, the police took up the invitation to them to conduct further investigations.
So, I mean, last we left the show in 2014, the prosecution, the lawyers for the Royal Commission who had investigated referred the matter to the police, and that's where it was left. And then some interesting things have happened in the interim which changed things significantly. So not long after that, say around 2015-16, entered Pastor Bob Cotton, who is a qualified member of the Australian Christian Churches, is a Pentecostal pastor of a small country church about an hour out of Sydney in a place called Maitland. And he decided that because the law for concealing a child abuser at that time was no more serious than use of foul language in public, or walking your dog without a lead, or riding your bike without a helmet, it was a misdemeanor. So what Pastor Bob Cotton decided to do was to collect enough signatures, which was 10,000 at the time, I think is the number, that was the golden number to, bring attention before Parliament. Stop me where I go wrong here, Nathan. And they had to be handwritten signatures. These couldn't be, emails or, check a box online. And he did the miles, and he got some help as well, of course, and collected signatures around the state so that the concealment of this child abuse would go up from being a misdemeanor to being a much more serious offence. And at the end of 2018, I believe it was the 5th of December, those laws under Attorney General Mark Speakman in New South Wales, those were passed. So what happened was that there was an addition to Section 316 of the Crimes Act, Section 316A, which meant that the maximum penalty had previously been 2 years. And, there's no way that police are going to chase someone for foul language and get them a maximum imprisonment of 2 years. But when that law changed and had additions to it, the maximum penalty increased to 5 years for concealment and 7 years if there's a benefit. So if I said to you, Nathan, listen, keep this quiet and I'll give you that managerial office over there next year, that's a benefit. So there's an increased penalty if it's been found that, you actually benefited from concealing the information. And then with that happening, police powers were increased. I understand a task force, a special group of officers was actually formed to investigate this matter with Brian Charles Houston. And the investigations have been going for 2 years before he was charged in August of 2021.
I think that's a fair summary of the situation, but I'd have a couple of qualifications. The current prosecution seems to revolve around whether it was a criminal offence for Brian Houston to conceal the knowledge of the sexual assault that his father had admitted to and not report it to the police. Now, my understanding, and again, not a lawyer's understanding, but a reading of the Crimes Act, is that in 1999, when Brian and other Australian Christian churches leaders became well aware of these offences, is that it was already an offence under the Crimes Act to conceal a serious indictable offence.
Yes, yes.
Section 316 of the Crimes Act in New South Wales said clearly that if a person has committed a serious offence and another person who knows or believes that the offence has been committed and that they have information which might be of material assistance in securing the apprehension of the offender, then it is an offence to withhold that information from the police, to not report it. I think what you were referring to, Tanya, was that those laws were strengthened in 2018
Yes.
to make it even more explicit that to conceal evidence of child sexual offences
Yes.
is even more serious. So there was already a prohibition about not reporting a serious indictable offence.
Yes.
And I believe that the police have probably brought that prosecution under the law as it stood.
I think they are applying the new legislation retrospectively, otherwise that task force wouldn't have been formed.
My layman's understanding is that it would be very unusual for a law to be applicable in a retrospective manner.
Yeah.
And what we will all know when the court proceedings begin is the basis upon which the police, or the prosecution I should say, have a case that they secure a conviction with. And we don't know the answer to that question. And because we're now in the realm of speculation, we should probably say no more about that.
Well, I mean, it is interesting to look at, why the DPP has made the decisions that it has, because there's also a little bit of background I thought we should just go over in terms of other cases we've seen in this country. Because as such, this case is a test of these new laws. There was a case in South Australia of Philip Wilson, who was a bishop who had been told of a child abuser in 1976, and it was brought before the court in 2015 that he had known this information and concealed it. And Wilson was actually convicted and given, I think, 6 months of house arrest, which was then overturned on appeal. So the first time concealment of a child abuser by a member of the clergy went through, it was overturned, and there was a level of disappointment from the public that nothing sort of serious had happened, although, the courts had suggested that it was, a 40-year-old story that, could be argued somebody might not have a recollection of whether they were a priest or it was a serious matter or not. And the other major case was of George Pell, who's the third most important Catholic in the world, who actually went to court for child sexual assault charges of his own, which he was found guilty for, went to jail for, and again, that conviction was overturned on appeal unanimously by the High Court. Supreme Court?
I don't know.
A higher court. And he was set free. And while those were actual assault charges that he faced himself, Pell had a long history of being rumoured to, and, having actually been found to by commissions of concealing pretty serious sex offenders in the Catholic Church. So both of these times, the Australian public and the broader community overseas as well has looked at these cases. They haven't gone very far. And I think there would be a fair bit of pressure on the DPP to see what they can do with these new laws that have been in effect now for 4 years.
Look, I agree. And it's curious to me that the Department of Public Prosecutions have been so specific in bringing this charge against Brian Houston on only a single count. Because it was known, and it's in the public domain, that Frank Houston had other victims, potentially as many as 9 victims, over many years. And you could say that those victims were also denied natural justice by the church hierarchy declining to take that information after they'd conducted their internal investigation. And the charge before the court now doesn't involve any of those. It's just a single charge relating to a single victim where it's contested whether the person wanted the matter to be pursued or whether there was an obligation, regardless of the victim's desire, for the police to be given the opportunity to look at the case.
How do you measure these things? How do you contain them? I guess you have to narrow it down to a specific date and time and event. What we're going to just do is have a little look at a website that sydneycriminallawyers.com.au put up last year, because of course we are not going to speculate as to anything to do with Brian or the circumstances around it. But what will take place from here is we understand it's a judge-only trial, which means there's not going to be kind of complications of jury members falling asleep or, doing outside research or those kinds of things. It could potentially make things a lot simpler to follow. But what we understand from this website, and I will put this up on socials. So Hillsong has issued a statement maintaining that it's disappointed that the police have charged their leader, and it raised the point that many other church officials had been aware of the allegations before Brian was, yet they too chose not to report them. And, that's contentious stuff as well. And it may well come down to, because a lot of people are saying, well, why wasn't the rest of the family and the rest of the church charged? It might be in terms of policy about who the official officer was in charge, where the responsibility lay at the end. And that's what you were saying earlier, Nathan, that part there.
That's correct. Well, the offence of concealing a serious indictable offence carries a couple of caveats. And it's possible that one of the defences that will be offered is that there was a reasonable excuse. And the reasonable excuse that may be offered in this case is that the complainant was, by that point, an adult and had allegedly said that they didn't want the matter to be pursued. And there was evidence before the Royal Commission from this particular victim of child sexual assault at the hands of Frank Houston. So it's true that this offence in the Crimes Act of concealing a serious indictable offence carries a caveat, and the caveat that you can have a reasonable excuse for not giving something to the police.
And that's called, that there's a reasonable excuse. I mean, one of the other ones is if you were frightened for your own safety that you didn't report a matter to the police. And as I said, the laws have changed so much now. There's even an addition of, 43B section, which is about reducing risk to the community, which wasn't in existence then. Now, has this cleared things up a lot like mud for people? What's going to happen from here, do you think? The trial's been set down for 3 weeks, and somebody said to me the other day, look, Brian Houston himself was in the stand at the Royal Commission for 4 hours. So what are they going to do for 15 days?
This is a subject of considerable interest. That the court have scheduled 3 weeks for a hearing means that Brian Houston and potentially other witnesses that we don't know about yet are going to be subjected to the closest scrutiny of the events that occurred, a review of all of the relevant documentation about whether claims or statements that were made to the Royal Commission were complete or factual.
The biggest question that people are asking out of this whole thing is Brian Houston going to go to jail? And I think we can feel fairly safe in commenting on the fact that, Australia's punitive system, its system of punishment, is nowhere near what we see on the TV for the United States. We just don't have the incarceration similarities. So it's got nothing to do with guilt or innocence to say that I don't particularly see any kind of heavy custodial sentence coming down for someone, even if they were found to be guilty. But again, who knows? And I'm looking at the focus on the DPP. The DPP might be really keen to make sure that these laws are tested thoroughly and that they work. I mean, I don't know if that's where the pressure lies, but, you know, for anyone who's hoping for some kind of serious outcome, Australia's not like that. You're lucky to get 5 for murder.
I'm not as cynical as you, Tanya. I think, you know, the penalties for this kind of criminal offence can be very severe. And I have faith in the system that, you know, a person's celebrity or their previous global status doesn't immunise a person from being held accountable. And that's why we're all going to be fascinated to follow along and hope that there are, you know, impartial media accounts about the progress of the trial and the subsequent judgment.
Fascinating, thank you.
You're more than welcome, Tanya.
And that's about as far as we can go right now. You know, apart from looking at a bit of self-care, how to look after ourselves, you know, because this is quite a peculiar situation. You don't have this very often where, you know, major religious leaders are subject to criminal processes. So it's a unique situation, and I wonder if we made any of that clearer or just made it more complicated.
No, I think we've kind of covered the subject.
Thanks,
Okay.
Nathan. We'll check back in soon, yeah?
Yes.
Thank you. Say bye. Say bye.
Bye.
Bye. Isn't he just the most wonderful person? He's so kind and generous in supporting me and helping me and just giving as much as he can to try and push for truth, whatever that means. Thank you, Nathan. Thanks everybody for making it this far. I hope that has helped a bit. Please don't leave your opinions about the case or your hopes and dreams or new evidence that you dug up from the attic that you think you should share. Please let us know. We can refer you to police if you want to share anything. Otherwise, we are grateful to our justice system for striving for the fairest outcome. I know that this raises a bunch of issues for a bunch of people, and we're going to be looking at self-care. We're going to get we're going to have a little chat during the week and look at some tips for kind of how to get through 3 weeks of pretty confronting stuff for a lot of people way outside the realms of just one church. But please keep liking, subscribing and sharing with anybody that you think could benefit. Keep sending some messages because I love those things. They make my days. You can always drop by Patreon or PayPal for Leaving Hillsong to show your Pentecostal love in the way of money. But the most important thing that I want you to think about is all this stuff about kindness that I've been banging on. I even have my mother kind of trained. She said to me yesterday, you know, look after yourself. And I said, well, you look after yourself. And she said, well, you know, keep Leaving Hillsong. And I was like, that's right. This trial is going to bring up a lot of emotions for a lot of people. And let's think about maintaining relationships and taking 5 and stepping away instead of one moment or one phrase or something that happens doing any damage. So we're going to talk about extra ways of being kind to ourselves and still being able to be kind to other people. And of course, keeping on Leaving Hillsong. Did you know you can't defame an organisation of more than 30 people? So, yeah. I'll be keeping as close a track of this case as possible and give you as many updates as I can. Facebook, Twitter, Insta, even TikTok I started, so stop on by and say hello. And we'll talk soon. Bye.